All right. Hi, guys. We'll be talking through Chapter 5 today and discussing amphibians. So, as you probably picked up, there's a lot of controversy around the ancestral origin of amphibians. Was the ancestor a lungfish or a lobe-finned fish? Are amphibians polyphyletic or monophyletic in origin? And locating the founder populations that allowed for the divergence of amphibians in the fossil record has been like finding a needle in a haystack. So there is some thought that an extinct group of lobe-finned fish may be the closest relative of tetrapods, and these organisms had both gills and lungs. They had muscular fins that allowed for coordinated movement across the bottom of shallow, swampy areas and might have allowed those fish to exit the water and avoid predators, or even to move to new water bodies when needed. So make a note that the cladogram that we have on this slide can be viewed as tentative, and some of the shared-derived characteristics can be seen on the right side of the branch point in the cladogram, but almost every aspect of it is somewhat controversial. Some of the groups are based on recent molecular evidence, and that we know is a good source of information for understanding relationships among these organisms. There may have been an ecological and an environmental imperative behind the evolution of amphibians. The Devonian period experienced huge climatic fluctuations with wet periods and severe drought as well. And as bodies of water became smaller and more crowded, they would have also become stagnant and eutrophic. So using lobed fins and their ability to breathe air, it's thought that the ancestors of tetrapods might have been able to move between some of those shallow waters onto a muddy shore and move across land in search of more water. And I've got a video later of mud skippers for you guys to kind of see how this movement happens. So the Labyrinthodontia were the earliest known amphibians of the Upper Devonian. They were found in freshwater deposits in Greenland. They appear to have been the most abundant and diverse amphibians of the Carboniferous, the Permian, and the Triassic periods. And they show a primitive structure with a fish-like thick roof for the skull, and the first fossils date back to almost 365 million years ago. Another early group, the Lepispondylu, this group of small salamander-like amphibians, they appeared in the fossil record during the Carboniferous and Permian periods. They're distinguished on the basis of their vertebral construction, which was formed by the direct deposit of bone around the notochord. And it's still not understood exactly what their systematic relationship is to amphibians. The Lysanthia, another group that represents sort of early amphibians, this group includes salamanders, frogs, and toads. Salamanders, like fossils, are found in the mid-Jurassic period and the mid-Tertiary, and they're across North America, Europe, and Central Asia. The oldest known frog-like vertebra was taken from Triassic deposits about 200 million years old in Madagascar. And its relationship to modern frogs is still unclear, and so it is placed in a separate order. So several problems had to be overcome in order to survive on land. Um, and one of those problems was locomotion. The weight of the body in the terrestrial environment um, is passed on to the legs. The primitive bony elements of the pectoral fins over time differentiated into forelimbs. However, many amphibians still cannot fully support the weight of their bodies with their limbs. And in this case, some of them still use the lateral undulating movement that you see in their ancestors, with limbs that help sort of sustain the forward momentum, but are not fully responsible for their movement across a terrestrial environment. The evolution of skin and the loss of scales made desiccation a significant threat to the survival of amphibians, and it was solved partly by the development of the stratum corneum, that single layer of dead cells, part of the skin, and by the presence of mucus glands in the epidermis. Another problem that amphibians did not solve was the ability to reproduce away from water. So this greatly limits the distribution of amphibians and the habitats that they can exploit. We know that fertilization is external in some salamanders, but however in most it occurs internally with the spermatophore, and we'll talk more about that later. But many amphibians undergo larval development within the egg and hatch in an immature version as an adult. But as you know, many more undergo metamorphosis and actually have a stage of the development where they are aquatic tadpoles. So there are more than 6,600 described species of amphibians, so a fairly diverse group. Most of those are frogs and toads, and smaller numbers of some of our other groups. By far the greatest diversity of amphibians occurs in the tropics, generally between 23.4 degrees latitude on either side of the equator. So let's go through some of our organ systems, and we'll start with the skin. And there's actually a lot to talk about with the skin with amphibians. So amphibian skin is permeable to water and gases. It also provides protection against injury and abrasion. Many species absorb moisture from the soil, which occurs mostly in the pelvic area. In the pelvic area, sometimes the skin is heavily vascularized, and it's referred to as the pelvic patch. It accounts for about 10% of the surface area, but about 70% of water uptake in some amphibians. So really important to avoid desiccation. Minerals can also be absorbed through the environment and through the skin. In addition to protection, amphibian skin is important for respiration and for thermoregulation. So the skin structure. The skin consists of an outer thin epidermis and an inner thicker dermis. The epidermis is composed of a single layer of keratinized cells that form a distinct stratum corneum, so a middle transitional layer, and then an inner layer that gives rise to all those epidermal cells. Molting or shedding of the outer epidermal tissue occurs in both aquatic and terrestrial salamanders, and generally that shed is consumed by most species immediately after sloughing the skin off. Amphibian skin is the topic of some really interesting research. So For example, antibiotic peptides in frog skin are being investigated as a new antibiotic drug. And some of these peptides can also selectively destroy tumor cells and might provide another drug for cancer patients. Glands of the skin, we see glands that are responsible both for mucus secretion and for protection. So mucus glands continuously secrete to keep the skin moist, and it allows it to perform those important functions for respiration and water uptake. Excessive excretion of mucus is another way that amphibians might protect themselves from predators. Granular glands can produce noxious or even toxic secretions in some amphibians and make them unpalatable to predators. And these glands can occur in masses and often give a roughened texture to the skin, such as the warts that we see on toads. Toxic secreting glands are most common in frogs, and one group of frogs possess extremely toxic steroid alkaloids in their skin as a chemical defense against predation. So those alkaloids can leave an unknowing predator with neurons and capable of transmitting nerve impulses and can actually quickly lead to cardiac failure and death. Some frogs develop their toxic chemicals and are able to amplify them by ingesting prey with toxic compounds. So, for example, ants and other arthropods often carry the poisonous compounds that end up in the frog's skin. Most species that possess noxious or toxic secretions are uniformly red or yellow or orange in color. So we often see those that investment in toxic compounds being matched with warning coloration. And that provides, of course, a visual cue to the predators to avoid those frogs. It sends a very clear message. And they're also pheromone secreting glands that are, of course, essential for reproduction. A few other features that we see in the skin would include the webbing between fingers and toes, adhesive toe pads on some frogs that help create surface tension and allow them to climb up seemingly horizontal surfaces, and of course the ability to change the color of the skin to provide for camouflage and even for regulating temperature. So that type of color change can be regulated in a few different ways. In some cases by the movement of chromatophores or by shifting pigment granules around in the cell, and that would be controlled by the endocrine system. So just a brief little video on one of these fascinating frogs that has the ability to hold on to some toxic compounds, the poison dart frog. So let's talk a little bit about the skeletal system. Compared to fish and their fish relatives, the amphibian skeleton shows some increased ossification, so density and calcification of the bone, loss and fusion of some elements, and extensive modifications that really allowed for terrestrial locomotion or movement across land. So the skull can be entirely ossified and contain less bone than some fish. And with the evolution of life on land, we saw some significant changes in the vertebral column. So it became more specialized. It served to support the head. It had to be able to support the weight of those internal organs and serve as a brace for the appendages. So, for instance, in salamanders, there are 5 different vertebrae present, whereas frog vertebral column is divided into 4 regions. So the earliest amphibians had well-developed ribs. In modern amphibians, ribs have been reduced somewhat. A true sternum appears for the first time in amphibians, and it's more advanced in frogs. The evolutionary origin of the sternum is still unclear, but one theory is that it resulted from the fusion of the ventral ends of the thoracic ribs. The pectoral girdle has been important in amphibian systematics. We see a considerable diversity in the limbs among modern amphibians as a result of the different types of locomotion that they use for their life on land, their time spent in water, and also other activities that we see them doing, such as burrowing and arboreal habits as well. So the anterior limbs consist of the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, as well as carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Hind limbs consist of femur, tibia, and fibia, as well as tarsals and metatarsals. In additional bone, the prehallux occurs on the inside of the foot and commonly supports a sharp-edged, sometimes tubercle used for digging and burrowing species. The muscular system, so the body musculature of amphibians really varies widely. Some are similar in pattern to fish, and we already talked about the fact that in some cases we see similar movement of amphibians, the way they move across a terrestrial environment. So in some cases they're very similar to fish, whereas in other more terrestrial species are really markedly different. So salamanders, of course, still use a lot of those fish-like undulations to move and have a similar muscular system. As vertebrates evolved into more land-dwelling forms, the axial muscular decreased in bulk as locomotion function was taken over by the appendages. The cardiovascular system and respiratory system, of course, had to undergo some significant changes. The evolution of lungs was a significant development in the evolution of vertebrates, and also the development of an internal septum in the heart. So most amphibians, this was essential for keeping oxygenated blood separate from deoxygenated blood. So in contrast to the simple two-chambered heart of fish, many amphibians have a heart with two atria and a single ventricle. And so you can kind of study that in the picture here, a three-chambered heart. The septum is incomplete in some salamanders, but it's generally complete in frogs. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the sinus venous. The left atrium receives the pulmonary vein and oxygenated blood. Respiration. So during development, we know that a lot of larval salamanders and tadpoles pass through the stage in which gill arches form gills. And for most, the gill circulation is lost in the adult form with the development of air-breathing lungs. So many amphibians also utilize at least some gas exchange through the skin. Another really interesting note is that amphibians are the most primitive vertebrates to have the anterior end of the trachea modified to form a voice box or a larynx. So a lot of frogs have paired or medial vocal sacs. The size, the shape, and the position of the vocal sacs is species specific. And there is evidence that at least some terrestrial frogs are able to use great acoustic and visual and chemical cues in species recognition and in mate choice. So this is just a really cool diagram that shows the unique way that frogs are able to breathe, and generally amphibians are able to use a unique force pump mechanism to get air into the lungs. And so air, if you follow the diagram, enters the oral cavity through the nares or the nostrils. When the nostril closes on the floor of the oral cavity, the air is forced through the glottis and into the lungs. And frogs can use this mechanism to blow themselves up to a larger size. Lungs, which is, of course, a defense mechanism that they can use. Lungs became more evolved in frogs. Lung linings became more complex for the uptake of oxygen and included folded tissue and alveoli, which are small respiratory pockets that we see in other vertebrate species as well. So pulmonary oxygen usually accounts for about 20 to 50% of the total gas exchange in some salamanders, but up to 80% of the carbon dioxide is released through the skin. Digestive system. So most species of amphibians possess a tongue in the oral cavity. It may be attached by its interior and its posterior end. And the frog tongue is a well-developed, sticky organ that's important for gathering food and particularly for gathering insects. A lot of amphibians have small teeth, and those teeth are attached to the inner side of the jawbone. And the function of teeth in amphibians is to grasp and hold on to their prey, but not to chew. And the boundary between the esophagus and the stomach is not necessarily distinct. The stomach's usually sort of an unspecialized enlargement that retains food and mixes food with digestive enzymes. So as in other vertebrates, we see that species that are more herbivorous have longer intestines than species that are more carnivorous. And some amphibians have digestive tracts that are coiled to maximize their length based on their diet and their digestive needs. All amphibians have a cloaca that receives the contents from the digestive system, from the urinary system, and from the reproductive system. And I recently heard Allie Ward, who does a podcast called Ologies that I highly recommend, talking about the cloaca, and she suggested that it was like Steve Jobs had created it because it was just a one-stop shop for so many of our vertebrate species. A little bit about amphibian sense organs. So the nervous system of amphibians is generally a brain. Consists of a pair of olfactory lobes and a pair of cerebral hemispheres. A penile organ is present and may serve as a photoreceptor, but only remnants of the parapenile organ can be found in amphibians. Sense organs, we see neuromast organs are still found in amphibians. They are able to perceive low frequency vibrations in the water, and they allow the animal to maintain equilibrium and posture. Amphibians have ears. Amphibians share several advantages of a more developed ear. So they possess an auditory system with three main divisions: an outer ear, a middle ear, and an inner ear. And that system is sensitive to both ground vibrations and to airborne sound waves. So the ear of most frogs is highly developed. The outer ear in most frogs consists of a tympanic membrane, and some frogs may actually use the tympanic membrane also as an amplification device when they create sound, receive sound. eyes of terrestrial amphibians are large and well developed. They show a lot of advantages over fish. Salamanders, we know, have good color vision, but frogs probably only have a little bit of color vision. We see movable eyelids, and orbital glands are present to help protect the eye. Eyelids are absent in purely aquatic salamanders, and many frogs have a transparent fold of skin called a nictitating membrane that we'll see in other vertebrate species as well. And that membrane is drawn over the eye in order to protect it. And in some cases, we have cave-dwelling species that are completely blind. So the penile organ, as we said, is present in all amphibians, and it functions as a light receptor on the top of the head between the eyes, and it appears to be important to the establishment of rhythms of thermal regulation, of gonad development, and also orientation. And olfaction. So amphibians have a double olfactory system. Air enters the nasal chamber via the nares and exits via the internal nares into the oral cavity. So we also see a rudimentary Jacobson's organs present for the first time. That organ consists of a ventral segment of olfactory epithelium that's become isolated in the oral cavity, and it probably plays a role in the recognition of food, and it's used to test a substance that's held in the mouth before ingesting it. Taste buds can be found scattered over the dorsal surface of the tongue and also in the floor of the mouth. A little bit on the endocrine system. Amphibians present really the first evolutionary appearance of the parathyroid glands. Parathyroid hormones raise the calcium and phosphate level in circulating blood by pulling those minerals from stored sites like bones when they're needed. So amphibians present the first evolutionary appearance of those, which is sort of a fascinating occurrence. And as in other vertebrates, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland help to regulate reproductive behavior in both males and females. We see estrogen and progesterone controlling the development of eggs and breeding behavior. We see androgens in males that at least partly control the swelling of thumb pads, the reproductive organs. They can help to influence a change in color pattern and development. The urogenital system and reproduction. So the pronephritic kidney is functional during larval development, and it's later replaced with a full adult kidney in most adult amphibians. The bladder in all amphibians is thin-walled, is a thin-walled pouch off the wall of the cloaca, and it receives and stores urine and also helps with water regulation and ion exchange. A little bit on the reproductive system. The size, shape, and position of oviducts varies with amphibians. So the opening is generally ciliated and its walls contain smooth muscles. The lining of the oviduct secretes several little jelly envelopes around each egg as contractions help to carry the eggs through the oviducts. The caudal portion of the oviduct may enlarge to form an ovisac where the eggs are temporarily stored. So in some salamanders, the mesonephritic organ carries both urine and sperm, but in many, the pronephritic duct has lost its excretory function and only carries sperm. So a duck only carrying sperm, as you all likely know, is known as a vas deferens. There are three broad categories of reproduction that we see. We see aquatic development, that's eggs in water and larvae in water. Semi-terrestrial development is when the eggs are deposited out of the water, but then the larvae actually develop in the water. And terrestrial development is when both the eggs and young are completely independent of water and develop in a terrestrial environment. As you might imagine, weather and environmental factors highly regulate breeding in amphibians. So both precipitation and temperature are major factors affecting breeding. We see that sexual rhythms are under the direct influence of those environmental factors. Most North American amphibians have an annual cycle of breeding and become active with increasing temperatures, either in late winter or early spring. And then rainfall often stimulates early breeders like spring peepers and wood frogs and spotted salamanders. And we do also see some breeding behaviors in amphibians. We see courtship behavior. Salamanders recognize other members of their species using visual and olfactory cues. Courtship rituals can involve nuzzling and rubbing of the body of a potential mate. A variety of courtship activities occur in frogs as well. And some of the most complex and elaborate mating behaviors have been recorded for some of the species of poison dart frogs, including some really specific postural displays and species-specific calls in those guys. About 90% of all salamanders use internal fertilization. A single male salamander may deposit a packet of sperm in a spermatophore on submerged leaves or twigs. One male spotted salamander deposited 81 in a single evening. He was a busy guy. And females are able to grasp the spermatophore with their cloaca and take the sperm packages into the cloaca so that eggs can be fertilized as they pass out of the female's body. So salamanders can store sperm in those sacs for months or even for years. We see a good bit of variation in growth and development in amphibians. So a lot of amphibians grow continuously throughout their life. That's called indeterminate growth. And many breed in 1 or 2 years of age. But we have some species of frogs, for instance, the rounded frogs can remain as tadpoles for 2 or 3 years before they become adults. Newts can spend 4 to 8 years in a terrestrial juvenile stage before returning to the water and maturing. And hellbender salamanders, large North American salamander in my part of the world, may require 5 to 6 years to mature. And a little bit on the variation in growth and development of the species of amphibians that are oviparous, so egg-laying, deposit their eggs in the water. Salamander eggs can be attached individually or in small clusters to underwater vegetation. Other salamanders deposit their eggs in moist sites on land. And frogs exhibit a wider variety of larval development than any other group of vertebrates. So many frogs lay their eggs in water, either singly or in big globular masses that I'm sure you've seen before. But there are a lot of exceptions. So amazingly, other frogs possess dorsal pouches on their back in which eggs can be incubated, or eggs may be attached at the back of the parent where they remain until hatching. Nearly 800 species of frogs throughout the world About 20% of all known species have lost the free-swimming, feeding tadpole stage. So lots of varieties. So these frogs lay eggs that end up hatching directly into four-legged little froglets. So that Viviparous, there are 4 African toad species and one frog known to give birth to live young. Female toads, in that case, supplement the yolk with secretions from the oviduct and give birth to the newly metamorphosized toadlets. And then embryonic development ranges from 1 to 2 days to 9 months in some cases. It's generally temperature dependent. The time from fertilization to hatching can be 13 days to 275 days. And most frogs, on the other hand, develop faster than salamanders. So with hatching ranging from 1 to 2 days to 40 days. And most amphibians that undergo direct development require 15 to 50 days to hatch. Hatching and birth, amphibian embryos produce hatching enzymes that assist in the digesting the membrane and closing them at the time of hatching, and the development into adulthood. So during metamorphosis, lungs form so that atmospheric air can be used for respiration and gills, and the gills in that case are gradually reabsorbed. The digestive system becomes adapted for a more carnivorous diet, and the tail is reabsorbed as at the same time that the limbs form. So most amphibians can breed the year following birth, but as we already mentioned, there's a ton of variability in that pace of moving into adulthood. We see a lot of diversity also in parental care. So for many years, we thought only a few amphibians exhibited parental care, but with more study, we found that there's quite a bit of parental care out there. And so we see guarding and brooding of eggs and young. We see adult salamanders sometimes guarding eggs. They also moisten their eggs and aerate their eggs. And that type of care can last for 5 to 6 weeks or as long as half a year. So parental care has been shown to decrease the risk of predation and increase productivity. Got a cool little film here on hellbenders that I thought you guys would enjoy, and a few review questions. And that's it. That was a little bit of a beast of a lecture, but that is it for an overview on amphibians.